Hey, this video is going to talk a little bit about economic theory and economic reality toward the end of the year 2015. I'm responding to some statements made by a particular influential charlatan here in Canada, a guy who makes his living talking about politics, philosophy, and economic theory here on YouTube. I feel like I should give the guy some credit because it's a miracle that in a country with as little intellectual activity as Canada, that anyone can earn their living talking about politics, economics, and philosophy. So in that sense, I'm happy for him, and I'm happy for everyone who gets engaged in these kind of debates and who's sincerely interested in and concerned with these fundamental questions. On the other hand, I'm now going to proceed to disagree with just about everything this guy says. This first chart I'm going to throw up, which as you can see is a very simple screen capture from his recent video. He presents, I'm going to look at just two of his charts here. He presents this as self-evident proof, not only that the American economy is in a terrible crisis, but that there will be no economic recovery. When I saw this the first time, this was playing and I was doing some housework, paying attention to the things. I was hearing him giving this over-the-top narration about what this was supposedly proving or indicating. I looked at the chart and I really laughed out loud because the chart shows the exact opposite. This chart does not prove his point. The bright yellow line on this chart there is the Dow Jones Industrial Average. So the argument he's presenting, what he's inviting you to believe or imagine, is that there has been no economic recovery since the crisis in 2008, and that there will be in the future no economic recovery. That's what he's claiming. And this chart shows the exact opposite. Here's a different chart of the same thing. This is the Dow Jones Industrial Average. It's just a little bit easier to read this one, but this is the same thing that we just saw before as a bright yellow line. The Dow Jones Industrial Average is an index. So this is not measured in percentage points and it's not measured in dollars. It's just measured in a unit of the index. Not worth explaining what that unit is for these brief discussion. However, back in January of 2009, I can see looking at the chart here that it dipped down to 7,000 units. Okay, moving forward to February of 2013, it had more than doubled. And it continued to increase above 14,000 units. So to me, it's completely surreal that somebody giving a public lecture would present this as unquestionable evidence of an economic collapse from which there has been no recovery and will be no recovery, when this shows the exact opposite. This shows an economic recovery. Now, the Dow Jones Industrial Average does not tell you everything about a society. It is one useful statistic. And one reason why people are interested in the statistic is that it does correlate to employment and unemployment pretty strongly. When the Dow Jones Industrial Average is doing well, that's normally a positive indication for people's chances of getting a job and keeping a job over the longer term. But this is a positive indicator. This completely disproves the guy's theory. It hit a low and it recovered from that low and then continued to grow after that fact. So let's be skeptical here, though. Maybe my bête noire, who I'm disagreeing with, maybe he's still right. Maybe there has been no economic recovery. Well, what are we looking at here? This is the unemployment rate in the United States. It's not perfect. It's not ideal. We don't live in an ideal world. But as you can see there, over time, there was an economic recovery. Unemployment went from 10% down to less than 6% in a fairly steady progression. And what happened to bring about this change? Well, a couple things happened. Of course, just lately, the price of gasoline has gotten much cheaper. But what policymakers and policy analysts would indicate as being the crucial decisions made by the United States was, on the one hand, embracing the quantitative easing program, we refer to as QE1, QE2, QE3, and also embracing low interest rates. Now, this guy I'm disagreeing with, this guy I'm criticizing here, he presents this chart of American interest rates. This is a benchmark rate, one of several you could use to indicate how the U.S. government is setting rates, he again presents this as a self-evident sign of an economic collapse that is ongoing and from which there will be no recovery. He does this simply through the use of poetic imagery, which, he's entitled to. I'm not knocking his use of the English language. He vividly describes this as being equivalent to a pulse monitor in a hospital of someone's heartbeat tapering out, because toward the right-hand side in the last few years, since 2009, it is flatlining. Well, yes, if this were a human heartbeat, that would be a negative indicator. That would indicate that you're dead. And he goes on at great length to interpret this as supposedly showing that the American economy is dead and there will be no recovery. However, that metaphor is completely meaningless and completely misleading. Interest rates do not resemble a human heartbeat in any way. There's no meaningful comparison there whatsoever. When interest rates are low, it means that you can get a bank loan more cheaply. Now, in reality, it doesn't really affect ordinary people in the same way that it affects large corporations. A large company that is looking to open a gold mine in Canada now really has an incentive to take on the debt and open that gold mine while interest rates are low. A big project like that, opening a new factory, investing a lot of money for the long term, when companies get deeply into debt, those are the types of projects that are really impacted by this type of near zero interest rate. So, I think it's really worthwhile for everyone, no matter where you are on the political spectrum, to challenge yourself to give a lucid account, not just of your factual claims, but of the values that are lurking behind them. So in this case, it's just presented to us as if it were self-evidently terrible for interest rates to be low. Well, why is that? Why would you think that's a bad thing? Now, I have my own biases and my own values. There is a sense in which I'm sort of prejudiced against this style of economic intervention. I'm not a fan of the quantitative easing program that the United States elected to embark on. I'm not a fan of what its outcomes were in Japan or the United States or in Europe, where similar imitative economic interventions took place. I have my own critiques and my own biases, and I can discuss those in an open and responsible way. However, I'm not going to lie to you and say that because I'm biased against it, it doesn't get results. The United States cut interest rates to near zero. And in many ways, it got the results that the U.S. government was hoping for. It showed that gradual decline in unemployment. I may not like it. I may have reasons why I might think some other economic policy would be even more effective or more ethical or would lead to greater social justice. There is a real question of justice, a question of responsibility on the part of bankers and, people who are guilty of financial malfeasance in the 2008 crisis. Those are all important questions. They're not what we're addressing here. This chart of interest rates being at near zero doesn't address any of those questions. So maybe worth talking about. But getting at the kind of ethical underpinnings of our ideas about economics is tremendously important. And I just want to say, in some ways, the fashions in economics are comparable to religious beliefs. Beliefs in different religions come and go with time. And people do fanatically and fundamentally believe in economic assumptions. One of the great beliefs in our time, and for the people who are now older than 60 years old, the type of people who are prime ministers, presidents, bureaucrats, technocrats, almost all of those people who are in powerful decision-making positions in the government and in the banking sector, those are all people over 60 years old. If you're 55 and you're in a senior position like that, the press remarks that you're young, a young and upcoming politician at age 52. So, this is a world of gray-haired people. For that generation in power right now, they really are the generation that lost their faith in Keynesian economics and the theories of John Maynard Keynes, and that among other things, really their new faith, what's often called monetarism, it's also called the efficient markets hypothesis. These are different. Those are not two different names of the same thing. These are different ideas that became popular. The assumptions of neoliberalism. These are people who, almost like an article of religious faith, believe that low interest rates will help unemployment. So it will increase employment, will increase economic activity, and will get people good jobs. So in some ways, yes, that is like a religious belief. And if you really talk to government bureaucrats and even elected officials, boy, you can sometimes feel the intensity of that being equivalent to religious belief. But it's also fundamentally different from any religious idea in the following crucially important way. In general, economic theories that people may believe to be true under all circumstances, to be true globally and universally, in general, they're true under some circumstances and not under other circumstances. So that's totally different from anything in the world of religion. That's totally different from anything in normal sort of democratic political discourse. Someone who is Catholic, who believes that abortion is evil, they believe that's true under all circumstances. But this type of economic belief, one of the reasons why it can be so powerful is that there will be examples where the economic theory works. And neoliberalism, in terms of a playbook, in terms of an instruction manual for what to do with the economy, in some circumstances, it has had very positive results, and in some, it has been a total failure. People like Christine Lagarde, current head of the International Monetary Fund, different leaders of institutions in Europe, I think they tend to ignore the negative examples and to focus on the positive examples. We'll come back to that in just a moment. Okay, one positive example that's sort of close to my own heart, whether I love it or hate it, something that's been a big part of my life, is the island of Taiwan. So this methodology of chopping interest rates, engaging in quantitative easing and other methods to maintain liquidity, maintain the status quo with bank players, etc. Okay, it's associated primarily with Japan. In some ways, Japanese-style economic policies have actually been more effective in Taiwan than they have been in Japan. So look at this chart. How did Taiwan respond to the economic crisis in 2008? Well, there you go. They chopped interest rates down to near zero. Okay, so what was the outcome of this economic policy in Taiwan? There you go. There was a crisis. Unemployment shot up to 6%. Not very high by Canadian standards, but very high by Taiwanese standards. They chopped interest rates, and they had this recovery. Okay? And as their economic situation improved, they restored interest rates, not all the way, but they inched it back up from a very low rate to a more moderate or reasonable rate. Okay? So this is the neoliberal ideal. Okay? Taiwan's economy performed exactly the way a certain kind of monetarist, neoliberal economic playbook would like the whole world to behave. Right? Unfortunately, or fortunately, the whole world doesn't behave that way. Now, I'm not saying this as someone who loves Taiwan unconditionally. I know the reasons why Taiwan has this type of economic strength and can bounce back that way. The island of Taiwan is very different from the island of Ireland, and it's very different from the economy in a place like Canada. Taiwan is a miserable place to live for some obvious reasons. You can't drink the water. You can't breathe the air. Pretty fundamental, life on Earth. The intensity of industrialization in Taiwan is horrific to behold. It's awful. You live on the southwest coast where they have the shipping industry, the steel industry, plastics manufacturing, electronics manufacturing, computer exports. Well, that gives Taiwan a lot of economic resiliency in the post-2008 and recovering from this economic crash. it also means you can't breathe the air, you can't drink the water. There are a lot of other social problems that come out of that. They're dependent on importing cheap labor from Indonesia and the Philippines. Numerous social problems I could mention that are related even to the strengths of their factory system. However, on this chart, looks pretty good. And in terms of the people who are over 60 years of age, who are sitting in power around the world, they look at that and they think, me too. If you're the prime minister of Spain or France or Greece, you look at this chart and think, wow, I wish I had unemployment under 4%. Probably the prime minister of Canada looks at this stuff and thinks, wow, I wish I had unemployment under 4%. And they don't really think about the underpinning variables, the deep institutional, economic, social assumptions for why this economy behaves this way. All right, so here's Japan. Japan, this is a 10-year chart, by the way. This is not a short period of time being shown here. Japan has had interest rates at zero for an absurdly long period of time. And again, I want to come back to the basic premise presented by my bête noire here, my great Canadian theoretician who I'm disagreeing with. If interest rates were in any way comparable to a human heartbeat, then Japan would be dead. And it's been dead for many, many years, right? That's the ridiculous theory, that this is a sign of an economic crisis with no recovery. And not only no recovery past tense, that there will be no recovery for in the future tense. This period of time here, we're looking at like 2008, 2015, a few extra years in there. I got to keep it real for you. I've lived in Cambodia. If you were living in Cambodia during this period of time and you went to visit Japan, let's say you lived there for a year, you would think Japan was paradise on earth. You would think, wow, what an amazing society, what an amazing economy. In every way, the education system, the drinking water, public transportation, from head to toe, Japan would be a very impressive society to you. Imagine if you went from Athens in Greece, same scenario, and you visited Japan during this period of time. Do you think you would regard Japanese society as a disaster? I mean, these are real questions. If having interest rates near zero is a disaster, then Japan, as an example, should affirm this hypothesis. Now, there are serious social problems in Japan. I'm not an uncritical fan of Japan. I'm not going to digress for each of these examples into all the things I dislike about the country, but I am not sitting here as someone who's biased in favor of Japan. I'm not someone who's presenting Japan as a positive example for countries like Canada and Ireland to imitate or emulate. One of the reasons for that is that I don't think Canada can. I don't think it's possible for Canada to reproduce the same positive outcomes that Japan gets from these policies. And there were a lot of factors there. Some of them, like the ones I mentioned just now for Taiwan, having a massively industrial, export-led economy, export-oriented economy is what we like to say. Canada doesn't have that. Canada, this is from memory, but in the last 15 years, from the year 2000 to the year 2015, the percentage of our GDP that's occupied by manufacturing declined from 18% to only 10%. We already were well into deindustrialization back in the year 2000. Decade of the 1990s was not a period of rapid expansion of manufacturing in Canada. So these same theories, same playbook of how to handle 2008 financial crisis, it won't have the same outcomes for a country like Canada as it will for Japan. And we're about to see it doesn't even have the same outcomes for Japan as it does have for Taiwan. Okay? And a deindustrializing country that maybe only exports raw materials like Canada, not exporting finished manufactured products, in our case dependent on oil exports, gold exports, diamond exports. But you know, in Canada, we drive a lot of Japanese cars. In Japan, they don't drive a lot of Canadian cars. We're not exporting a whole lot of cars from Canada to Japan. It's the other way around. Capiche? um, these are the factors. Well, look, I mean, the others are, labor mobility. There's so many factors to get into here that these abstractions don't really show you. But hey, what's the outcome for Japan? If you think near zero interest rates are such a bad thing, what if you were sitting right now in Madrid? You were wringing your hands over the economic crisis in Spain, and economic planners say to you, do what Japan did. Look at Japan. They recovered from the crisis. They brought unemployment from 5.5% down to below 3.5%. Spectacular. Okay? What's the point in saying there is no economic recovery? There will be no economic recovery. In many of these countries, there already has been economic recovery. So back when the U.S. made the decision to basically imitate Japan, I was laughing. I thought it was hilarious because the Americans have been snubbing the Japanese for decades about macroeconomic policy in Japan. And then as soon as America has a crisis, they're trying to imitate the Japanese. QE1, quantitative easing phase 1, did have some significant differences from the Japanese equivalent to quantitative easing. QE2 and QE3, they're even closer to Japanese. America reproducing this Japanese strategy. Quantitative easing plus dropping interest rates to zero. But again, you look at that chart for Japan, you think, hey, this is a country that endured this type of economic problem while maintaining very low rates of unemployment. A lot of people take that bargain. Okay, Canada, already talked about it a bit. Same basic strategy. Not quite as rapid a drop to zero interest rates, but in response to the 2008 crisis, interest rates come down to near zero and then come back up again a little bit. Yeah. There's Canada's unemployment rate. Has there been an economic recovery? Yes. It's a mediocre economic recovery in Canada's case. Okay? Canada has not recovered, I would say, as well as the United States. But on the other hand, within my lifetime, 6% unemployment, 7% unemployment, that's about as good as it gets in Canada. We have a lot of different factors to blame for that, including the decline of manufacturing, as already mentioned, the decline of a lot of things in this country. But that includes also our somewhat ridiculous labor policies. We have a government here that wants to keep the cost of labor low by importing cheap labor from Latin America, Asia, all around the world at all times. So that maintains a high rate of unemployment and relatively low wages, creates a lot of dynamic inequalities in society. That's also part of the sort of playbook of neoliberalism. Has it worked out for Canada? In some ways, yes. In some ways, no. I would say the results here have been mediocre, but as you're about to see, not as bad as, say, Ireland. Right? So for all of Europe, they now have a European Central Bank. And European Central Bank, again, same basic playbook. Let's do what Japan did. But you could see, actually, back in 2009, 2010, the European central bankers were actually a bit more skeptical about jumping into the latest Japanese fashion. So it's not until 2014 that this benchmark interest rate really gets down to zero. Maybe it's only then they recognize how desperate the situation is, or that they're convinced to try to imitate something Japan has done such a long time ago. Unemployment in Greece, 25%. Okay, you want to talk about a situation where there has been no recovery, there is no recovery, there is no hope for the future. It does not describe the situation for the United States at all. The United States has had a recovery, and that's obvious in the Dow Jones Industrial Average. It's obvious in the unemployment rate. There has been a very real economic recovery in the United States, not in Greece. Okay? The Greek economy doesn't have any of the strengths of the Japanese economy, doesn't have any of the strengths of the Taiwanese economy, and it also doesn't have any of the strengths of the Canadian economy. All right, here in Canada, we can still just dig up gold, dig up oil, dig up a lot of natural resources and sell them. We're still cutting down trees, believe it or not. We're balancing our books to a large extent, as we always have done since our colonial period, through resource extraction. Now, would I rather live in Greece or Taiwan? A lot of people go on vacation in Greece for a reason, for many reasons. Cultural heritage reasons, as well as the natural beauty of the place and so on. If you've been to any of the big cities on the west coast of Taiwan, any of those great centers of industrial production, they're pretty much hell on earth. Okay. My impression from afar is that the towns along the coasts and harbors of Greece, relatively pleasant and beautiful places, yeah? Olive trees and all that. So yeah, Greece has some advantages. Anyone who's on the far left, anyone who's a sincere communist sympathizer, socialist, far leftist, you tell me, when you're above 25% unemployment, why don't you have a revolution? Right? A lot of talk out of the left. If you were actually sitting and waiting for capitalism to break down so you could rise up in revolution, as per Karl Marx's original theory, if you actually believe that theory, then this would be it, folks. And if you want to know why the rate is dropping, Greece has a declining population. One of the reasons why unemployment goes down is that people give up looking for a job and move to another country. And the Greeks do have labor mobility. They can pack up and move to Berlin. They can look for work elsewhere. Okay? Of course, when you have a long-term economic crisis like this, you also get fewer people being born. Women choose to not have babies or delay having babies because same thing that happens in a civil war. You get real demographic impacts. Okay? This is the chart for Cyprus, the island of Kypros, another country I've had some interest in over the years. The numbers are not as astronomical. We're here looking at about 16% unemployment. But again, in real terms, there is no recovery. Okay, so in this case, pessimism is appropriate. And in Cyprus, I think everyone who could leave the country already has left the country before 2014. They have a fair bit of mobility, especially links to England. People going from Cyprus to London, try to get a job and so on. But at this late date, probably everyone who can leave already has left. Okay, my heart breaks for Cyprus. Terrible situation. Not getting any better. And in terms of the playbook of neoliberalism, I'm not talking about at length here, but this is really the type of nitty-gritty people should get into. Guess what? The theory works great for one island, Taiwan. Doesn't work for many of these countries in Europe, including Cyprus. Spain. I used to live on the border between France and Spain, down in French Catalonia. We had the refugees from this economic crisis coming across the border, and a lot of the local jobs were being held by Spanish citizens, who were generally Catalan, rushing across the border to get any job they could, fixing up the streets and what have you. And plenty of them were miserable and were vowing they would keep going to Germany because they hated France so much. Well, everyone's a critic. Look, this is a real crisis. Again, Spain, have population decline. You have unemployment decreasing, partly just because people are leaving the country entirely. People are no longer having as many babies, etc. So this is a profound crisis with no recovery in sight. Okay, but not the United States, not those charts we were looking at earlier. Right? Finally, it is tragicomic to me. It is both tragic and hilarious that Christine Lagarde has held up Ireland as a positive example of the theory working, this is a much more elaborate theory of government austerity combined with a checklist of neoliberal policies. Ireland has had some decline in its unemployment, but I don't want to go on forever here. anyone who's taken any time to look at the social, political, economic reality of what's been happening in Ireland in the last few years, you tell me if there's any cause for optimism. Ultimately, Christine Lagarde holding up Ireland as a positive example is totally self-defeating, because even if she were correct, even if my cynicism were misplaced here, and Ireland really were a tremendously positive example of an economy that has bounced back, guess what? The population of Ireland is less than the population of a medium-sized city in China. More people live in Xiamen, China, than live in the whole country of Ireland. So even if, the policy works in Ireland and Ireland has bounced back a little bit with unemployment only at 10%, we shall be delighted to have 10% unemployment, right? It's a moot point. All right. I can't believe how long it took me to make what's such a fundamentally simple point here. Look, for my generation, I'm old enough to remember the world as it was before 1989, and I'm young enough to have really been sensitive to the shockwaves of fad economic theories that spread around the world, primarily through the internet, around the time of the Occupy Wall Street movement. Okay? The ridiculous theories about let's get back to the gold standard and demonizing central banking in general, and this weird mix of libertarianism and incoherent social Marxist critiques of neoliberalism. Occupy Wall Street for me was really kind of a crossroads of bad ideas about economics that nevertheless captured public sympathy, because of the social context of real fear and apprehension about the outcomes of still ongoing economic and financial crisis. Economic theories are different from religious beliefs in that even the worst economic theory is going to be true under some circumstances. And the theories that currently rule the world, I personally, partly because of a difference in values, I'm biased against them and I disagree with them. But I recognize that those theories are true and valid and effective under some circumstances. The fellow I've chosen to frame this video as a disagreement with, he doesn't really explain what his problem is with low interest rates. But even if you really feel that having near zero interest rates is a problem, ethically or economically, you still have to be willing to recognize that in some circumstances, that theory gets the desired effects. Look, we had a whole generation of people who believed that everything John Maynard Keynes taught was wrong, was discredited. And of course, they followed right after a generation of economists and politicians and social leaders who thought that everything John Maynard Keynes taught was right. Now, Keynes was one person, he was one economist, but there's a whole category of social policies and economic theories that we call Keynesian under the influence of Keynes. Anyone with a detached attitude looking at the same evidence would just say, well, Keynes was right about some things and he was wrong about some things. And he set down economic policies, some of which are true and effective and useful under some circumstances, and others not so much. But people do tend to believe in these things with a kind of religious fervor, and they also tend to be disillusioned with them in the same way that a religious believer loses their faith. So yeah, we got to see the roller coaster of Keynesian economics. And now, in the aftermath of the 2008 crisis, I guess we're seeing a similar sort of disillusionment with some of the fundamental assumptions of neoliberalism. I'm very far from being a fan of Japanese economics, But when you think about it logically, perhaps the first country where we will really see a next step beyond neoliberalism might be Japan, precisely because Japan was the first country to adopt what's now international phenomenon of quantitative easing, etc., the sort of late neoliberal playbook for bailing out your economy. So it would make sense if Japan now, under the leadership of Abe Shinzo, might become the first country to turn that next corner and start really thinking critically about what aspects of neoliberalism have to be reconsidered, what aspects jettisoned.